This session is called Building Solidarity in the Arts. We have three of my great friends here with us today, and I'm going to start off with representing the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art, Matria Malkin, from the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art. We have next to her, she's the president and CEO of the DuSable African American Museum, but she's also the president of the Museums in the Park. And I believe you may be the first person of color to be the president of Museums in the Park. And then we have Mónica Félix, who is the executive director of the Chicago Cultural Alliance. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we have collaborated and how we need to start working together and be in solidarity with each other. I know that there's some opening statements that a couple people wanted to make, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art here.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, my name is Matria Melnik. I'm president of the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art. It just had its 50th anniversary, and it was founded by immigrants, political refugees, kind of like what's happening in Ukraine right now. And why was it established? Well, in Ukraine, artists were either put in jail or killed for their creativity because they were going outside the Soviet box. But here in America, it was built to show people Ukrainian contemporary art, as well as have a venue for contemporary artists, because the big institutions were not allowing that. So those were the two reasons. But with time, so it started out as a Ukrainian institution. With time, it's changed its focus, and it became a place for all people. And then in 1998, the Cultural Alliance was formed, and we were one of the 6 core members. So we are with the Alliance from its birth. Anyways, I just want to say that we have been collaborating with the National Museum of Puerto Rican Culture and Art for a long time. We're friends. We've had exhibits. In 2017, we had an exhibit called La Galleria, or Chicago Gallery, where we had art from your museum in our museum, and you had our art in your museum. And it was a wonderful collaboration. And then I think a year or two later, we had another exhibit called Forgotten Forms. And it was an exhibit at our institution with a Puerto Rican known artist with one of the Ukrainian artists, and it was about urban landscape. And it was a wonderful, wonderful and quite visited exhibit. So it's really important. I think it builds solidarity and respect and just collaboration, cross-cultural collaboration through the arts. And I think art has no language. It's just art. But what I really want to talk about very quickly is the support we got when Ukraine was attacked. Imagine you go to bed in your nice warm house, and the next day your mom tells you take, one toy and your mom takes one suitcase and you're going somewhere where you don't know where you're going. And that's what happened. But, you know, we as an institution were, as everybody, tried to help Ukraine with humanitarian aid. So we were raising money. And, you know, it was amazing how people of different nationalities helped us. We had a jazz concert. I don't know, Orbit Davis, Lynn Jordan, a very famous Polish jazz singer was there, Leandro Verade. You know, all these people were supporting us. And it was just so wonderful that it was cross-cultural. And they were helping us all along to the point where we, as an institution, we're not big, we raised with collaboration, we raised over $600,000 and we handed it over to Ukraine. So, you know, again, it's so important to build solidarity. As a matter of fact, next week, the Mexican Museum is having an opening with their Dia de Muerte, their Day of the Dead altars, and we were asked to create an altar there. So we're, again, collaborating, and I just want to say that whoever is interested in working with us, we would gladly, you know, collaborate on some project or come and talk to you, to your constituents about even what's happening in Ukraine and how people are helping us. So I think that's about it. I tried to kind of quickly say what I could, but again, it's my last thought is how important it is to build solidarity, respect, understanding for each other's culture, especially in today's world. We have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There was one other exhibit that we worked together on, which was when we first opened up in 2014. And that was an exhibit that talked about, although this was a Puerto Rican community, this is a Puerto Rican community, Humboldt Park, we put together an exhibit that talked about all the various cultures that had lived in Humboldt Park and how this building had been, or the surrounding park in the area. And so the Ukrainians were part of that, the Norwegians were part of that, the Jewish Council was part of that, the Italians, we had just a bunch of different cultures here. And it was one of the best exhibits we ever did because we learned so much about each other's history. And so we have been close ever since then. And the other thing there is that there's the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art, and there's the Ukrainian National Museum. And they work, you want to see how two organizations can work together, you got to go to see them because they have actually both worked together throughout the decades together. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to my great friend Perri here. Perri and I have been partners in crime for a very, very long time, even before we got into the arts. But Perri has done fantastic work over at the DuSable. Now it has a new name, and I'll let her kind of share that with you. But Perri, please.
Thank you so much, Billy. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, listen, it's such an honor, Billy, to be here with you and your team and all of you in attendance today and for this whole symposium that's been happening this week. Congratulations, and you're doing a fabulous job as always. So Billy and I have known each other actually since your aldermanic days, right? And I had also worked under the Daley administration doing multiple different projects. Started out leaving private law practice and going to be an attorney at Chicago Public Schools when we were working when Gary Chico was CEO of the schools on the capital program. And from there, I worked under Ben Reyes at the Public Building Commission, and then went to City Hall, then went to a couple of other places, and ended up becoming CEO of the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority, which you may know is the public landlord of White Sox Park, right? So the Sports Facilities Authority is a jointly administered agency between the city and the state. So Jerry Reinsdorf's landlord, which he didn't like much, but that's how that goes. So I have been president of the DuSable Museum for almost 7 years. In fact, it is 7 years, I think, next week, which is amazing to me how time flies when you're having fun. But we rebranded recently, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the DuSable, we are the oldest independent Black museum in the country. And we had been known as the DuSable Museum of African American History for 61 years. And we recently rebranded in June of this year, on Juneteenth weekend, as the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. And why is that? Well, for a few reasons. One, just look around the country, look around the world. It's time to not focus entirely on what we're doing here as African American history, but as Black history globally. Recognizing the connection that people of color of African descent have across the world, whether it be Puerto Rico, whether it be Brazil, whether it be the many Caribbean nations, whether it be the continent of Africa. We're everywhere, right? And although we are connected by cultural elements, the history is not exactly the same, and the stories and experiences are not exactly the same, but they're all tied together, and there's a commonality across the globe. So we wanted to really speak to that, recognize the great diversity even within the Black communities across the world, and start telling those stories, particularly stories of colonialism, right? What difference it makes when you are from a nation that had been colonized, say by, I don't know, Great Britain, and how the African countries and Caribbean countries in particular, some have only recently gained their independence, right? Barbados was, what, this year, last year? African nations, many not until the 70s. Latin American and Caribbean nations only in the 90s, right? So when you look at just the news of the day, in terms of the reaction to the Queen's passing, right? It's a mixed reaction, right? And guess what? It's about time we talked about things like that. It's about a time we acknowledged these histories of oppression that so many people, Black, brown, and otherwise, have undergone. The Ukrainians, right, have undergone from more powerful entities that seek to oppress its people. So that is one reason. The other is to put education in our name. Our founder, Dr. Margaret Burroughs, who created the museum in her home in Bronzeville in 1961, was a teacher, first and foremost. She was an educator. She taught art, she taught literature, she was an artist, a visual artist herself, a teacher of art, a poet, a writer, right, a creator. She actually started what came to be known as the Arts in Prisons program, right? She would go down to Stateville Penitentiary once a week and work with the inmates in the penitentiary making art. And that became sort of like this art therapy movement. And now there are many, many organizations that have arts programs in the jails and in the prisons. And we see what an impact that makes. So education has always been part of our mission, a primary part of our mission, but putting it in the name does what, right? You had the folks with the money up here, just previous to us. And it is true that the philanthropic community hasn't necessarily caught up with the idea of viewing museums also as educational entities, right? Educational organizations, even though that's really what we do, right? We do it through different media and mediums and art and culture and history, but we still teach, right? And it's a safe place to teach. And as you know, the artists are the ones who come out socially in times of crisis and create those safe spaces, and they speak for all of us, for the trauma that we are going through at the time. And you saw that during the pandemic, and you saw that during the times of protest after George Floyd's murder, right? So that education center and the name, very, very important. We are hoping that it will attract more funding, and of course that's at the center of what Billy and I have been working on for several years now, since I joined as president of DuSable, the Museums in the Park Coalition in 2015. I think it's been, my gosh. Well, we had a big win this year.
Yes, we have.
So we can talk about that a little later. But that's, in essence, what who I am and what the DuSable Museum is. And I just want to say thank you for making me part of this discussion today.
I just want to add a couple of items here, and that was that, Perri and I also worked on a speaker series where we had a speaker here and a speaker at her museum, and so we worked on that together. And before COVID happened, we need to relaunch this again. We have been having these discussions about putting together a joint exhibit on the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. And so we need to revise that, but that was what we were focusing on before the COVID hit.
Let's find a grant that we can apply for.
Yes.
Where's that Bank of America?
And let me just state a little bit, because our history with DuSable goes back some time. When this community tried to put up a statue of Pedro Aviso Campos, the Park District denied us and said that we needed to create another statue that would have the same types of materials that the rest of the statues had, although they had okayed the first statue. And so this community raised the money to create another statue, and 2 weeks before that statue was supposed to go up, they denied it again. So we got into a long battle. That long battle brought Margaret Burroughs, the founder of the DuSable Museum, to our defense. She was the president of the cultural committee for the Chicago Park District, and she stood with us the whole time, and actually she ended up resigning her chairmanship because of this issue. Needless to say, that statue led to the big Puerto Rican flags you see now on Division Street. But Margaret Burroughs played a big, major role in helping us get there. So thank you, Perri. And then Monica's new to the Chicago Cultural Alliance. But I'll let you explain what the Chicago Cultural Alliance is. And although her and I have not worked much together yet, her experience and what the Chicago Cultural Alliance does is very key to what we are discussing here today. So, Monica.
Thank you. It's true, I'm relatively new. I just started as the executive director in March of this year, believe it or not. But it's an old relationship, certainly. So the Chicago Cultural Alliance, as you mentioned, started as a beautiful idea, really, in 1998, coming out of the Field Museum. It originally was called Cultural Connections. And the motivating idea behind it was, you have folks at the Field Museum who are well-funded. You have a beautiful placement on the lakefront. It's very well known. But it's not the only cultural institution in Chicago. They recognized that there were dozens of other cultural centers, cultural heritage institutions that were working individually. They were not being supported. They had difficulty finding staff, getting funding. And so the idea was to bring them together in a way that they could work collectively and support each other. And so Cultural Connections was born from that idea. And so it was officially registered as a 501c3 cultural nonprofit in 2008. And the name was changed to the Chicago Cultural Alliance. You'll hear us referred to as the CCA or the Alliance, depending on who you're talking to. But what started as around 7 centers coming together is now 45 centers of cultural heritage working together. So we're proud to include the wonderful institution that has invited us today. Thank you so much, Billy. The Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art, and some smaller places you may not have heard of. I'm just curious, raise your hand if you're familiar with the Haitian American Museum of Chicago. We've got 4 or 5 people here. It's one of our smaller members, but a true cultural gem. Just to give you a sense of the sort of institutions that we represent, they started out as a very small organization, 300 square feet, sort of around the Lincoln Square area. And just this past weekend, this past Saturday, they had their grand opening to their new location, 3 times as big. They're able to show 3 times as many artifacts from their permanent collection. They have a full-time executive director, which actually is an improvement, and a larger community, a larger reach. And those are the kinds of wins that we love to see. They've been a longtime member. The Alliance has tried to support in a number of different ways. So what do we actually do? If you go to our website, you'll see language about our mission is to promote, support, and connect centers of cultural heritage in the Chicagoland area. What does that actually mean? Any number of things, whatever is needed. You'll see that our small but resilient team is always ready to answer questions about how do we write a job ad for a marketing manager, and what are competitive salaries for an organization of our size, right? So we'll help write those kinds of things. We'll send the language over. We promote events through our social media. So all of our web pages, our members will send us events, we share them. But even more important than that really is the knowledge sharing structure that we have in place. We have a town hall that meets every month. We ask for leadership to join if possible. Sometimes it'll be the collections managers or other folks. And it's a chance for everybody to just connect. We make announcements about grants or about opportunities to collaborate. We ask them to make their exciting announcements. And more often than not, someone will put a question to the group. During COVID, my understanding is that this was incredibly helpful to people who had to pivot very suddenly. You know, they were planning their annual gala or an exhibit opening, and suddenly COVID hit. And the question was, what do we do? Do we cancel it? Do we move to a virtual platform? And if we do, what do you charge for that? What does ticketing look like in a virtual space versus a physical gala? Everybody more or less had similar questions, and so it's a space to meet with your fellow decision makers in the cultural space and share some of the information that you have. We also like to form partnerships, so that's the connect part. You'll see in October, for example, our signature event is Journey Chicago. Some of you might have known it as Inherit Chicago. It rebranded a few years ago, but that is a month-long series of cross-cultural events. This year we have 11 events scheduled for the full month, and each one of them is a collaboration between 2 members. So it's 22 member organizations participating in this series all over the city, and you'll see some pretty amazing exchanges. So, for example, there's bomba at the powwow. You know, there's Puerto Rican dancing happening during a Native American powwow in Schiller Woods. And the whole idea is you bring 2 communities together who may not necessarily encounter each other organically in the city, you know, very different neighborhoods, different cultural communities. Bring them together in this one space and explore intersections. What does dance mean to your community? What are the roots of it? And what are some similarities that we can explore in this joint event? Another one that was popular in the past was rice. I think we all know a little bit about rice here. Just in my family, you know, just the whole history of how you're supposed to cook the rice, and the pegado is my favorite part at the bottom. You know, what does that mean for Puerto Ricans versus Native Americans, where you have it as a very strong part of their culinary tradition, where it has deep meaning to families and as a practice, and it's cross-generational. So we brought together the Puerto Ricans for that one. It was also Japanese Americans and the Native Americans. So that's what Journey Chicago is all about. It's about bringing people together across the city to learn more about a new culture, kind of go outside their comfort zone and feel that I am welcome here. This is not just kimchi for Koreans, it's the Korean Cultural Center trying to bring people in and teach others about their culture, to demystify it, de-exoticize it, and hopefully bring down some of the negative influences that we've seen in the past year with violence against the Asian community. I know that's something that they're particularly concerned about. And we do what we can. We offer micro grants, we facilitate, we organize. I get on my phone and I'll, you know, make phone calls and say, there's a big event coming tonight. I know it's last minute, but why don't you show up? And we're talking with Arts Alliance about this multi-million-dollar arts grant that's coming down from the state. It's why it's so difficult to encapsulate what the Alliance really does, because it's whatever is needed in the moment. We're largely funded by foundations, so 75% of our budget is coming from funders like the Donnelly Foundation, MacArthur, Treehouse. A newer funder is the Morse Genius Trust, folks like that. We're working on developing revenue-generating initiatives, though, as well, through some earned income, so it's relatively new to the Alliance. But otherwise, our board of directors is kind of unique in that it's a 50-50 compilation of folks from industry and also leadership from our core members. So we want our members to have a voice in the decisions and the strategic planning, but we also want community partners who are connected to banks and the foundations and maybe know a little bit more about business management, and they have some of those relationships that you heard the folks in the last panel talking about, so they certainly help with the relationship building. But anyway, I have plenty more examples, but I could talk forever. I'll just leave it here to see where the conversation takes us.
Thank you. You know, you should know also that in, I think it was 2015, they give out these community awards and to recognize various leaders in the community. And one of the people they recognized was, he spoke yesterday, Professor Jose Lopez was recognized by the Chicago Cultural Alliance. So, great. Let's take it to what are the advantages and what are the obstacles to working with a different culture. I know that sometimes it's not seeing eye to eye because everybody wants to work together, but there are some barriers. It may be the language, it may be something else. But I know that we've all worked together on things, but there have been some issues there. I think that what we really need to understand is what's the benefits to us as work when we come together. And I could give you an example, but I'd rather you all talk about that first. So, okay. Give it off to whoever wants to start.
So thanks, Billy. I mean, that's a really interesting question because it's all in the perception, right? Is it a barrier or is it a challenge, right? Or is it an opportunity, right? And I think, you know, unfortunately, so many of our challenges are fiscal, right? Are financial. So it's not about do we want to, do we desire to work with other organizations, but can we afford it? Do we have the budget, you know? Are there grants that we could create or ask the major foundations to create specifically for that purpose of cross-cultural alliances and projects, you know, multi-party projects. And it's interesting because I think that a lot of the funders, you know, would be pretty psyched to do something like that because it's almost like checking multiple boxes of what you have to do to give funding away. So it's not necessarily about the desire, but because most of our culturally specific minority-focused organizations are underfunded, right, are understaffed, it's kind of like you take care of what's in your building first. And I mean, it's really a huge difference, you guys. I mean, look, this place looks beautiful, Billy. But I know you've probably got places in the building that need work, right? I know I do. I hate it when I'm walking through a bunch of folks from someplace fancy and they see the duct tape on the carpet, right? But it's as basic as that, not having a level of funding to take care of facilities issues and repairs and personnel. You know, we can't pay our staff as much as they would make at the History Museum or certainly the Art Institute. And so I think that type of a coalition to get together to raise the money, because it's not the intention. The barriers are often really just financial. We would love to do the project that you're talking about, but we've got to go raise the money to do it, right? And of course, as a Black museum, we've got huge issues, obviously, in the Black community. We also have now being an education center, although we were doing all these same things before, we convene policy discussions, right? We're working with the University of Chicago Hospitals on a community health education series about medical disparities and disparities in treatment and disease and medical racism, which is something that Black women especially suffer for. And so we have such a long list of things that are essential to the well-being of our communities and the arts, that it's often hard to, divert that manpower or woman power and divert that financing to work on these really exciting projects like the ones you and I have done in the past. So I think, again, to kind of pick up on the previous discussion about funding, it's about creativity, right? And we are in these creative industries and creative institutions and organizations. So we've got to kind of convince our legislators, which also is something that we've been doing in terms of how do you perceive a museum, right? It's not the old way of thinking that a museum is this place where you come in and look at beautiful things on the walls and read a couple of things and leave, right? It is about engaging in what's on those walls, what's behind that painting, the history of the artist, the experiences of the artist. And a majority institution can't tell you what a Puerto Rican artist meant when she made that painting, what those cultural influences may have been, and that message that she's trying to get across. So it goes to the kind of the essence of what an arts institution is, but no physical body can survive without blood. And the problem is that our organizations have been anemic in terms of money for so long that we don't have, the luxury, because it does end up being a luxury to say, hey, I'm going to call up Billy and we're going to plan a big exhibit the year after next on African American and Puerto Rican organizations or art, right? Or Afro-Latino art, right? Or to call up Carlos and say, hey, let's bring back that exhibit that we had 10, 15 years ago with black art from Mexico, right? Those aren't easy things to do. An exhibit of that size costs $100,000. I mean, people don't realize that these things, even a smallish exhibit, costs a lot of money. So I think one thing that we have learned during the pandemic is the value of virtual participation and digital arts. And I want to say this too, where there are so many opportunities that could be created for our young people, right? To work in arts organizations, particularly the digital arts, right? Come in and take the content that so many of our organizations have and pull it together in a virtual exhibition, right? And us old folks, and I do admit to I'm older than the museum, so yeah. But these are opportunities, again, out of the box thinking for our students and our young people and our returning citizens, right? That have so much to say and so much to express. And so kind of packaging the money ask and opening people's eyes to a different way of looking at things, how what we do affects public safety, right? And public health, right? And public education. And kind of shifting that perspective to see, oh, if I put $100 here, it's gonna be a return on that investment of 1,000 or 10,000, as opposed to $100 going to, a big organization like rhymes with Barton Institute that is simply, pays for cocktail napkins, right? And so those are kind of the differences that exist at the different levels of our cultural institutions. And I think we could do so much more in horizontally collaborating outside of the silos, but it's about changing the system as well as changing our perceptions. It's not for want of desire, it's for want of resources.
I mean, if I could just pick up on that point, Billy, you asked about cultural clashes or different ways of interacting, but like you said, Perri, it's also an economic question. When you're dealing with centers, you're dealing with a number of different factors. So at the CCA, it's something that we are keenly aware of. Yes, we have the 45 centers, but their budgets range from $50,000 per year all the way up to $10 million per year. And we would love to perceive it as working horizontally across the cultural space, cultural heritage, but the fact is they're in very different brackets in terms of budget, in terms of capacity. Some are all volunteer organizations, others have 20 staff members. So how do you negotiate that? Recently, we were fortunate to participate in a DEI initiative that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. They brought in Justice Informed and had Xavier Ramey, and he used the CCA as an example of a collective action network. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms specifically, but in many ways it does describe what we do. We try to bring people together to reach a particular goal, to advocate for cultural organizations and have tangible change in the city. But how do you do that when we're bringing together, for example, the Haitian American Museum again, which I think their budget just went up to maybe $75,000 per year, and one of our other members, like the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Educational Center. A great example of that is I went out to the Illinois Holocaust Museum in April just to introduce myself and talk about potential collaborations. And I said, we've got Journey Chicago coming up in October. What do you think about collaborating with one of our members on a one-day event? And they said, oh, we plan years in advance. This is very short notice. April in advance of October. And I thought, well, that's fair. I suppose it is, and they have their own schedule. And then I went to Carlos at the Haitian American Museum, the executive director there, and that was maybe in June or July that we had this conversation. And I said, I know you've participated every year. What do you think about Journey Chicago? And he said, oh, ask me in a month or two. This is way too early. We don't plan that far in advance. So, how do you negotiate very different schedules, very different capacities like that? It's a true challenge. We try to bring people together on the question of transportation, and I'm going to mention it here because I have mentioned it in every single conversation I've had since I started in March with all of the funders, all of the EDs. Our city is divided, and I think we know, the history of redlining, which has defined segregated districts. It's forcibly defined some of the cultural and economic communities that we have in the city, and it makes it difficult to move between spaces. So, as a former resident of Hyde Park, I would try to get out to the West Loop and visit maybe, Greektown or head out to Ukrainian Village. If you're in a car, maybe 25 minutes, good time of day. If you're taking the bus, it's over an hour because there's transfers. You have to go downtown, switch buses. And especially now, it's not always safe. There's a rise in crime on public transit. It's time consuming, and if we're looking at someone, for example, who's an hourly worker, making maybe $10 an hour, and they're planning a nice outing with their family on the weekend, that's a real time commitment. We're asking for 2 to 3 hours really just for transportation for them to take that risk, to go outside their comfort zone and try out a new neighborhood, visit a new museum, and do something that should be free and educational for their family, but ends up being a huge time sink and just a heavy lift for someone in that situation. How do we resolve that question? I think it needs to be through continued conversation, meeting with folks at the city level who are some of the decision makers, meeting with people in public transit, and meeting with more heads of the museums to talk about, I don't know, is it a culture shuttle, culture bus, something that will make it easier for people to move throughout the city safely, cheaply, and take advantage of these cultural treasures that we do have to offer, which are not located downtown or on the lakefront. How do we actually get out there? So, that's the kind of collective action that I would like to continue to explore. But again, who has time for the meetings? Different capacities, different knowledge and budgets can be difficult to negotiate. I suppose just for a lighter example, since you did ask, Billy, for Journey Chicago this year, one of my favorite examples is we have an event scheduled called That Belongs in a Museum, to any Indiana Jones fans out there. But it's a collaboration between the National Indo-American Museum, the Dankhaus German-American Cultural Center, and one of our newer members, the Abrahamic Center for Culture and Education. And the Dankhaus, for any of you who know the German Cultural Center, there's usually a beer component. They have 3 bars in the building. It's a big part of German culture. They have a very rich brewing tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages. And so, of course, they wanted to sell beer. You know, they wanted to be in their lounge with comfortable music and have people bring family artifacts that they would share with the group, and have them decide, does this belong in a museum or not? What's the value to the society and to me? But the collaborator is the Abrahamic Center. And they present the Muslim experience in America, what it means to live here, how the community is treated, and of course they were unwilling to pay for alcoholic beverages as part of that event. So that was a great moment, I thought, of discussion and discovery for those institutions. They kind of learned what's important to their culture, what doesn't always work for some of these events, and they came to a great compromise. You know, they were going to have beverages and refreshments, just not an alcoholic component, and they're both going to promote it to their, well, all three organizations will promote it to their communities in 3 very different neighborhoods. And it was just great to see how the conversation progressed in a respectful way. But those are some of the really interesting exchanges that we see day to day at the Alliance.
Well, our problems are similar to your problems. We have part-time staff, all 3 of them. I work there more than I ever did when I really worked. Our institute is based on volunteerism, and it grew from just volunteers working and believing and loving art. So if we had funding, we could do, many times I think, oh my gosh, we could do this or this or this, but the funding's always a problem. And as you were saying, Puerto Ricans have a problem. We're even less a minority. There's not that many of us. There's not that many people that work for the museum. It's very hard. But I just want to say how wonderful it is to be able to have cross-cultural art or culture. You know, it's not only seeing the art, it's talking to the artists, it's finding out. You know, education's so important. And if we learn about one another, we respect one another. We need to somehow be able to do more cross-cultural exhibits, musical concerts, film, and all kinds of things, because that's the key. So I think everybody said a lot, so this is just something I want to add.
I want to give people an opportunity to ask some questions now. Anybody have a question? Back there, Felipe.
Hey, it's amazing how this panel has brought something that I'm an active participant in New York City. One of the things I do, I'm a folk artist with the Ponce Mask and Carnival of Ponce. One of the things that they did in New York City, especially the Eldridge Museum, which I am an active participant for the last 10 years, is that the Jewish community there, which is the main focus of that museum, has connected the Chinese community, which is right there in Eldridge, in Manhattan area. And they identified me as one of the folk artists that can contribute to the Latino influence in the area as well. To my shocking, I never knew that there was the melting pot visible in Chinatown with Puerto Ricans and Chinese. And I was in shock as well, speaking to people who were of Chinese descent and also speaking to me in Spanish. So to me, it was a revealing thing for me to see the melting pot in front of my face. So I was able to bring the culture of Ponce into that festival, and I've been doing this for 10 years now. The Eldridge Museum has been doing it for, I think, even further. So the Chinese community, the Jewish community, and the Puerto Rican community, or Latino / is part of that festival, and I've been part of that as well. I do workshops there, and they pay me for those workshops all day long. So I wanted to bring that up because what you're talking about has been happening in New York City, and I think it's a trend now that the cultural connections are being done, and multiculturalism is being forced upon now these festivals. Now, important to say, they documented my work into their documentation of their presentations and video. So there is a Chinese expert in the arts of China, and there is the Puerto Rican representative, who is me, and there are interpreters of all kinds of arts. Juan Gutierrez, Planero 21, is part of that too. So they are manifestations of cultural sharing in those areas of Chinatown and the Latino community there. So I want to share that with you because I think what you're bringing it up is very important.
I would love to talk to you about that after. I'll give you my card because I was having a really great conversation just this week with Lonnie Nassatir, who used to run, you know Lonnie, used to run the Anti-Defamation League here in Chicago and is now head of the Jewish United Fund. And we were talking about exactly this thing, right? Bringing together policy discussions, arts discussions around this racial hatred across the board, right? It's not just, anti-Semitism, anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, anti-Latino, anti-everything. I don't want to get nasty about it, but what did a certain governor just do? Put a bunch of Venezuelan refugees, people seeking asylum, and put them on a plane to Martha's Vineyard? Like that's supposed to be funny, right? Oh, we're gonna, right? You act like it's an insult or a bad thing. Thank you, bring me people who need help. That's the difference, right? And our cultures who have been so oppressed for so long cannot be afraid to come together and be stronger collectively than individually. And this artificial, break between the Black and brown communities is just that. It's a political construct, right? If you come to the DuSable Museum, we have one of our long-standing exhibitions down on the ground level. It used to be called Freedom, Resistance, and the Journey Toward Equality, too long. Now it's called Freedom, Origin, and Journey. And one thing in that exhibit, which you've seen, is this animated map of the slave trade, right? That shows dots coming from Africa across the Atlantic to this hemisphere, right? And people don't realize that less than 4.5% of the stolen Africans came to mainland, what would become the United States, right? Up to the colonies. Vast majority were in South America and Central America and the Caribbean, be it Puerto Rico, be it Cuba, be it Haiti, be it Brazil, which at one point was 45% African, right? So when I have school groups come in, and again, you talk about the, divided, segregated communities in Chicago, which cuts both ways, good and bad. It's good in the preservation of culture. It's bad when it comes to, racial equality and economic equality. But kids who come in and they'll be, because 88% of Chicago public schools are, students are either Black or Latinx, right? And so I'll have a primarily Latino school come in or a primarily Black school come in. And these are little kids, maybe 5th grade, 4th, 5th grade. And I'm showing them this, this animation. And this animation was built based on insurance records. Follow the money, right? Because we were the insured cargo in those ships. That's why they kept good track of the property, right? Because that was the money, right? That was the free labor. And I show the kids, I'm like, what does this tell you? What does this say to you? Ma'am, it says we're all the same. We're all from the same place. My God, it's like it just sends chills. And that's the true part of the story. And at that time, during the slave trade, our bodies were the currency. Now what's the currency? Our vote. Our vote. So that rift is a political construct for political gain and control. And as artists and communities through the children, if we start to see that for what it is, only then can we really overcome what's happening now and have this collective power. Because we collectively built this country, not the ones who are trying to deny these next generations the right to learn history. The very right to learn the truth is under attack. And that's where we have to come together, and that's where, I mean, we have to be as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than they are being right now.
I want to. Over there. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. He had the microphone.
There's a question. I didn't know I had the microphone. Do you collaborate with the Schomburg Center for Research in Harlem, New York? Schomburg?
We have, again, you know, the Schomburg is part of the New York Public Library system. They're really well funded. You know, if, actually when Khalil Muhammad was there, we collaborated a little bit more. But I did just get communication from them in the past couple of weeks. And it looks like we may have some, you know, virtual collaborations with them in the future. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing institution. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Let me
Thank
just
you.
state on that point, when we became accepted into the museums in the park, we went to the DuSable Museum with a big painting of Arturo Schomburg. It was our gift to Margaret Burroughs at the time. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hello, I'm next over here. Sorry. So very quickly, I actually worked at the Field Museum with the Cultural Connections program back in 2001, and in terms of, you know, that whole year, I guess we were focusing in terms of the collaborations on rites of passage. Internally in the Field Museum, we had problems because we were the most diverse department, so we were under attack and pressure inside the Field Museum, but externally with the rest of the group, you know, there was this mistrust because of the Field Museum as an institution, you know, and Rosa Cabrera was here yesterday, but, you know, eventually that became the independent, you know, network that you represent. But, you know, in terms of the politics of just collaborations and trying to maneuver, you know, some of those things, you know, how has that?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of politics, right, that can be taken in a number of different ways. First of all, there's a question of funding. And you know, Perri, you touched on this a little bit about the divisions and trying to create artificial competition between cultural communities. You have some of that. Some of us have shared funders. You know, the Alliance is not the only one to receive MacArthur or Donnelly money. Some people will see it as us in direct competition. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, the Alliance receives money to pay for support that we do of our members. We all know the same people, and I'll have a meeting with one of the funders and say, listen, you know, XYZ members are struggling. You know, here's my recommendation for support, if that's possible. Let's all work together to support each other. But beyond that, speaking of politics, it's always important to know your local representatives, alderman, state representative. build those connections. The last panel was talking about networking in terms of getting to know the banks or other folks, but also local politicians. And the more that we can work together as a unit to make an ask, to say, you know, 5 different wards are calling for this change. Here's signatures across a variety of different zip codes, which they use as code for different ethnicities. You know, everybody is looking for this to happen. The more change I think we'll see. It's not going to be immediate. You know, it takes time, and that's what I'm learning too in this position, right? It hasn't been a year yet, and I get a little ambitious. But I think ambition is good. You shoot far and you land short of your mark, but it's certainly going to be farther than if you just didn't try at all. So I 100% support us working together as much as possible. Obviously, I'm going to advocate for an organization like this UCA, where we have no vested interest whatsoever. You know, it's just a series of very committed, passionate directors and staff members who are idealists. They want culture to happen. They want to see a very tangible decrease in racially motivated violence in our city that we love so much. Beyond that, though, you have other organizations like Illinois Arts Alliance or the Department of Cultural Affairs. They all have their limits, though, right? Pros and cons, and so does this UCA, but just further examples.
We're going to take 2 questions. I know we have Anthony and Professor Alicia. I think you had a question. Oh, okay. So we're going to take 2 more. We're going to cut out the last session so that you guys are not late for your tour of the community and your pina colada and all of that sort of thing.
Oh, you didn't mention that.
Yes, I'll talk to you guys about it. Anthony, go ahead.
Yes. Well, I'm the president of the House of Puerto Rico San Diego, and we're part of an umbrella of the House of Pacific Relations that's in charge of all international cottages. We have like 31 or 32 international houses. That's including the House of Ukraine. We got a House of China, and you know, we got House of Colombia. You name it. You can travel around the world in an hour and a half, and they're all museums. And then we all come from a same kind of problem that we have, is we're all volunteers. We don't have funding. Everything is volunteer. Like for example, for us, you know, my staff, we don't have a staff funded where each staff member gets money. It's all volunteer. And so, like for example, we had, you know, issues with threats with like the House of Iran, House of Ukraine, House of Israel. So we all try to come together, try to help each other. And you know, like when we had the House of Ukraine issue with the war, we all stand behind the House of Ukraine. So we all try to pull our funding to help and then send the money, you know, to the country. And so, but the problem that we have is not everybody can do that. And so what we want to try to figure out is where can we go to find funding for communities like the House of Ukraine and other houses that, you know, are more in a threat issue, and somehow pull our resources together. So that's, you know, that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It's I mean, I think most of us got started by small grants. I mean, very, very small grants. When she mentioned Three House gives out grants of up to maybe 10,000. They don't give out big grants. They give out small. But those, you know, you combine a couple of those, and you could do something, you know. And just to help you out, we have an exhibit here, a Jack Delano exhibit. Jack Delano, for those of you who don't know, was a famous photographer that photographed Puerto Rico and the situation going on with the Puerto Rican people. But Jack Delano was Ukrainian, you know. And so we have an exhibit here. If you wanted to do a partnership with the House of Ukraine out in San Diego, we'll be willing to send you that exhibit. And you guys could do something together. We had one more question, right? Okay.
I'm feeling the pressure because I'm standing between you and the pina coladas, but
And sangria.
first of all, I just want to.
Don't worry, I'm gonna order mine right now. Hey.
You know, I was just reminded that actually I did a presentation probably about 10, 15 years ago at the DuSable. It was on murals, and so we had someone from the African American community, and then I spoke about the Puerto Rican murals, and so I love these collaborations. So just a shout out. The question I have is perhaps more directly related to the DuSable, but I think I'd be curious more generally. What are plans for working with the Obama Center, between the museum and the Obama Center, and then more broadly, you know, what is happening in the city with different cultural centers and education centers as it relates to working with the Obama Center?
Well, I'm not a part officially of the Obama Presidential Foundation. I do sit on the Inclusion Council for the Obama Presidential Center, have since its inception, and that's really to ensure that we have maximum participation by minority and women-owned businesses and businesses, you know, disability-oriented businesses. We have been waiting for some concrete engagement from the Obama Center. They sit almost exactly 1 mile to the east of us, and for those of you familiar with the Chicago park system, the South Park system designed by Olmsted, which some of the lawsuits, you know, love to talk about, but also want to ignore the fact that Washington Park and Jackson Park, and connected by the Midway, comprise the South Park system, right? And so you really can't and shouldn't separate Jackson Park from Washington Park because it is all an Olmsted design park. And so rather than drawing that smaller circle around just Jackson Park, I've always been an advocate for expanding that radius to include all of Washington Park and really looking at the park systems even beyond that to the Pilsen area where NMMA is located and the entire cultural community, right? So if you look at the tourism projections, right, and Deloitte, and you can see all of these numbers on their website, I'm assuming it's still on the website. Deloitte years ago was projecting about 750,000 new visitors per year. I think that's light, I think that's low. You know, I look at my direct experience with the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, and when they opened in 2016, I think those numbers are going to be closer to 1 million or more per year, at least in the first few years until there's kind of the equalization. So that is a market, right, that all of us should be benefiting from, right? And we should have a citywide tourism and marketing for arts and culture and history and multicultural, because the Obama Center is not a black organization, right? It celebrates our first black president and first family, but the Obama Foundation is a global foundation for developing leadership, global, right? And so we all need to be, I think, talking about how we are going to think about the various partnerships amongst multiple organizations, not just those like the Museum of Science and Industry that's closest, and then us. So I think that's a wonderful start to a conversation. I would encourage it. We have a great relationship, but I think now is the time with them really coming, and it's actually going to open, whether it's 2024 or 2025. Now's the time for those really serious, concrete conversations about how are we going to allow all of our cultural institutions to benefit from this major, major magnet, which I believe is going to include a very high percentage of international visitors as opposed to, you know, local visitors and domestic travel. Right?
Last question.
Just quickly,
Mhm.
are there any spots? Are they looking for people to represent our community and those committees at the wellness center?
You know, you'd have to check with the OPC. You know, they're located there in Hyde Park. Michael Stratmanis is the gentleman who does the VP who does the community outreach. But he is always happy to come out and talk to folks. So, you know, I would say, you know, propose the conversation. I'm sure they'd be open to it. And I'd certainly be happy to host the conversation at the DuSable when it happens.
Last question.
I actually don't have a question, I just have a comment. I think it's really important because, you know, to give a different perspective. So I am a museum professional, but I'm also a museum goer. And every single one of your institutions, including MPRAC, has contributed greatly to like my love for Chicago and my love for people. Like I've always been really into like hearing people's stories and making connections. And in 2019, in here in Chicago, I swear changed my life. Like I went to probably 85% of the programs. Like I wasn't sleeping. I was like, I have to go to Swedish because they're gonna talk about Doro Cratney, who opened the first Black photography studio in Chicago, you know, and so that was a collaboration with DuSable and the Swedish Museum. I went to the Ukrainian Institute and saw abstract art from Edra Soto and Yelena Hall, who I never thought I would see these two people brought together. You know, I went to the American Indian Center and saw drumming practices from Korean, Japanese, and Native American people, and it was the most beautiful month, probably, like one of the most beautiful months I've ever had. So I just want everyone to know, like, when we come together, we create magic. You know, we are all such beautiful people, and we have, as Puerto Ricans, we're in a position to connect to so many different cultures, right? And I think that in this, like Jose said, like in this U.S. Colonial enterprise, we're always trying to be separated. And when we come together, we're stronger and we're unstoppable.
And that's the fear.
Yeah.
Right?
So I just wanted to say that.
I think that's a great note to end on. It's a great point. Let's thank the panel here. Thank you all so much for today. Thank you. All right.